Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Graeme Bowman returns to answer questions that arose during his two-part appearance on the channel and to discuss Empire First, his book on the subject about Churchill's reluctance to the Overlord plan. Links to Graeme's website are in the description below, as are links to purchasing the book, or you can get it wherever you get your books. Let's hope the gremlins that were plagued us last time are cured. We had a nice chat this afternoon, so things were fine then. So good evening, Graeme. How are you today?
I'm very well, despite my team's defeat yesterday.
Yeah, we did football earlier. So you're going to give us a little recap first of the two presentations. Then, folks, we'll move over to your questions. I've got a couple to start off if you don't have any yet in the sidebar, but we'll hand over to Graeme to kind of just bring things to a conclusion from last time, and then we'll do questions. So there we are. So you're going to start with the quote there.
Okay, yeah, I mean, we covered a lot of ground in the first two talks, so I think a very quick recap of some of the main themes would be vital. So basically, parts 1 and part 2, but International Women's Day. Oh, jeez. So parts 1 and parts 2 emphasise Churchill's obsession with controlling Suez and the Mediterranean because they were gateways to the Britain's Far Eastern Empire. And I've given you quotes from Anthony Eden and Sir Maurice Hankey to illustrate Britain's obsession with controlling Suez. So just for a bit of variety, I thought I'd give you one from Sir Samuel Hoare, who, as we can see from all the jobs he held throughout the 30s and the first part of the 40s, was another consummate insider and establishment figure.
Yeah, folks, you're going to read that at your leisure.
So Hoare is obviously stressing how important it was to control the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, in order to get ships quickly out to the Far East. And just before we crack on, doing this talk has made me rethink about one or two points. And I would invite people to compare Hoare's quote with something that Andrew Roberts says on page 359 of Masters and Commanders, where he says that, quote, control of the Mediterranean had not really been a British policy objective since Nelson's day. So who do you believe, folks? Somebody who was there and an intimate part of the establishment in the 1930s, making it clear how important the Mediterranean and Suez was to Britain, or a historian writing 60 or 70 years later? So I think that's just something that people might want to focus on. Anyway, throughout my talks, I've argued that this Mediterranean obsession skewed Churchill away from northwestern Europe, and I argue that he authorised two operations to try and lock the Allies into the Mediterranean and maintain it as a British lake. So first up was Operation Accolade in autumn 1943. And of course, sadly, Accolade failed when Hitler deployed German forces to retake the Dodecanese from disorganized and inexperienced British forces and demotivated Italians, even though the Germans were often outnumbered 4 or 5 to 1. In early 1944, the landing at Anzio was designed to smash German power in central Italy before. So if we just put up the Anzio slide. So that's just a wee summary of the Operation Shingle. So the idea behind the landing at Anzio was to smash German power in central Italy before jumping across the Adriatic into eastern Yugoslavia. But it again failed when Churchill underestimated Hitler's determination to hold on to Nazi-controlled territory. Moving along to the sort of spring and summer of 1944, Churchill, the great advocate of the soft underbelly, then tried to block operations in the only part of Europe that offered a real soft underbelly, and that was Operation Anvil. And if we call up the next slide, people can read that and read some of Churchill's questionable objections to Operation Anvil, which was, of course, eventually launched 2 months and a bit later than it should have as Operation Dragoon. So, despite Churchill's predictions, Dragoon proved to be a huge success, which took Allied forces to Strasbourg, which is right next to the German border and very close to the Ruhr, within just over 3 months of Dragoon launching. And if we call up the next slide, Operation, which covers Culverin and the two American strategies. Again, I would argue that in the Far East, Churchill again prioritised empire over victory by championing Operation Culverin to recapture Singapore and Malaya. As we can see from that map, Singapore and Nagasaki are two, and Nagasaki is one of the southernmost island cities in Japan. The distance between Singapore and Nagasaki is almost 3,000 miles. So Culverin would have contributed very little to defeating Japan, but had it succeeded, had it gone ahead and succeeded, it would have regained some very valuable imperial territory. And if we call up the next slide, we'll see that Churchill confirmed his priorities for the Far East very clearly. As he says, he wanted what he regarded as Britain's rightful possessions in the Far East to be regained on the field of battle. There's nothing there about accelerating the defeat of Japan. Moving on to the latter part, October 1944, Churchill then endorsed Soviet control over Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary in exchange for British control of Greece through the percentages agreement, and that slide there summarises the final terms of the percentages agreement. And I argue that Churchill didn't really care about Greece or the Greek people or what political system they lived under, but he did care about their Mediterranean coastline and was determined that Stalin wouldn't gain control over it. My book, Empire First, knits all of Churchill's various Mediterranean obsessions into one overarching theory, which I call his Balkan triangle strategy. And that's your Balkan triangle there. I don't think you may agree or disagree with it, but nobody else has articulated this vision of what was motivating Churchill. So his plan to inspire a Turkish offensive into the Balkans failed because Accolade failed, but he did seal up the Aegean by securing the return of those two key provinces we looked at in the last talk, Western Macedonia and Eastern Thrace to Greece, through the percentages agreement. So that worked out okay. The jump across the Adriatic into Yugoslavia failed because Anzio failed, but fortunately for the West, after the war, Tito pursued a non-aligned policy, and although ran a socialist government and economy, he kept out of the Soviet bloc, and that helped keep the Soviets out of the Adriatic. The operation in Greece worked perfectly, mainly because German forces had withdrawn by the time British forces arrived, and thanks to the percentages agreement, Stalin ordered the very powerful Greek communist resistance not to resist the return of the British-backed Greek government to Athens in October 1944, and he also refused to support them when they started fighting British forces in December 1944. However, despite Churchill's best efforts, British imperial power started to disintegrate almost immediately after the war. India, of course, which contained 75% of the empire's population, gained its independence in 1947. And in the same year, Ernie Bevan, the Foreign Secretary, admitted that Britain couldn't keep bankrolling the Greek government. So America stepped in. Its president declared the Truman Doctrine, and the United States took on the responsibility of defending the West against the Soviet Union. And of course, British great power status finally crumbled 9 years later in the aftermath of the 1956 Suez Crisis. In some ways, you can argue that Churchill was maybe a wee bit like the famous King Canute, trying to hold the tide back and resist the inevitable. But of course, he was voted out of office in 1945 and, constrained by a lot of financial difficulties, the Attlee government bowed to the inevitable. So that's my recap, basically, Paul. So I'm happy to take some questions from yourselves and hopefully some of the interested viewers.
Well, there's plenty coming from the viewers already, so we'll deal with some of them. So, Terry Down, if Winston Churchill was so opposed to Overlord, then how did he allow such large forces and so much planning to be devoted to the operation? Did he not know that such a plan would create its own momentum?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, I think there was a two-track approach in the UK. I mean, obviously, they were doing things to ready themselves for Overlord because they were under pressure to go along with it. But I argue that Churchill was looking for ways out of it. And yes, you're right to say that once you start an operation, it does tend to develop its momentum. And there's no doubt that, for example, Montgomery, who was took over his role of ground forces commander in January 44, was 100% committed to making Overlord a success, as was Eisenhower, the supreme commander. But when I've looked through all the archive that I was able to access, I can find lots of strategy papers written by the chiefs of staff and Churchill, been very positive about operations in the Mediterranean. Lots of documents and comments been very critical and negative about Overlord. And I don't think I've really seen a major strategy paper before spring or summer 1944 written by Churchill or the chiefs of staff where they are wholeheartedly enthusiastic and positive about implementing Operation Overlord. So I'm going to take a risk here. If any of the viewers can direct me to such a document, that would be certainly very interesting for my thesis. But there's no evidence of Churchill or the chiefs of staff ever writing a document expressing unambiguous support and enthusiasm for Overlord. Always enthusiasm for operations in the Balkans, in the Mediterranean, great skepticism and negativity about Overlord, but nothing in favour of it. I mean, even one of the documents that the Chiefs of Staff, 11th of November 1943, said that there's no need to focus on Overlord with a fixed date, nor to even clarify how many divisions would be needed for the initial assault and follow-up. So that's November 43. I'll look out my precise notes. Oh yeah, I've got them here to hand. Yeah, so this is the 11th of November, 1943 aid memoir from Koss, insisting that Overlord, quote, on a fixed date must not become, quote, the pivot of our whole strategy on which all else turns, and confirming that they didn't, quote, attach vital importance to any particular number of days in the Overlord assault and follow-up, and that launching, and that's follow-up is the end of the quote, and that basically launching Overlord was contingent on the success of operations in the Mediterranean. So, as I said, I don't detect any great enthusiasm for Overlord amongst the four men who are basically shaping British military strategic pressure.
Okay, thank you. Well, we got more questions
there, Paul. Am I still coming?
Yeah, it's great. The test we did earlier was fine, and now we're live. We've got the buffering thing again. Just try turning your camera off for a minute, see if that makes a difference. Folks, we had a nice chat this afternoon. It was fine, but let's progress with this. So the next question, for me and Kai, how dependent on agreement of his war cabinet, or how much did he override them? Because this, in terms of Overlord, is he a lone voice among the war cabinet in being opposing it, or do the people around him of similar opinion? How does his relationship with them go?
Well, in terms of shaping Allied strategy, all the evidence seems to suggest that the War Cabinet didn't play all that big a role. It was really Churchill and Coss. Churchill in his role as Minister of Defence, and the three professional heads of the armed services. He tended not to, I mean, obviously polite lip service when required to the War Cabinet. And sometimes he would try to use the War Cabinet against the Chiefs of Staff, like over Operation Culverin, which he was very determined to push ahead with. Coss objected to Operation Culverin, and they felt that he would stage meetings of the War Cabinet and pack it with people who would support his point of view. So the War Cabinet played a secondary role in shaping Britain's military priorities. Really, Churchill and the four heads of the Taylor, the Secretary of State for Air, and the First Lord of the Admiralty and the War Secretary. And AGP Taylor describes them as basically they became superior civil servants in World War II. Churchill jealously guarded the preeminent role of himself and the Chiefs of Staff in shaping British strategic priorities.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's cured the buffering a little bit, but a little bit more. But we'll get more. Next question. The Canadian involvement. We haven't mentioned the Canadians. So Magician's Apprentice is saying, did the Canadians share Churchill's viewpoint about empire first? After all, they are part of the empire. Do we know what their feelings are, or are they sort of too low down the food chain?
I have to say that I wouldn't be able to comment in any detail on this. I ended up, if I ever put out a new edition of Overlord, I would include a chapter on the Dieppe fiasco of 1942, and of course that would be a good opportunity to introduce some aspects of Canada's involvement. But again, Churchill tended not to spend a lot of time consulting the prime ministers of the various dominions. He was good pals with Jan Smuts, and would share gossip, and Smuts tended to agree with him. But he wasn't really guided in any major way by what people like Mackenzie King or Menzies or Curtin thought about, how the war should be conducted.
Thank you. George VI came up in the last show, part 2. People were saying, how does George VI fit into this? Does Churchill try and persuade George VI, the king, to kind of step in behind him? Is the king trying to kind of be a mediator between the Americans and the Brits? What's your view on George VI and his part in this saga?
Again, that's not something I looked at in any depth, because he's the British head of state rather than head of government. Churchill obviously had his regular weekly meetings with him, and I'm sure that was very valuable for Churchill to let off steam. But I don't think George VI played an active role. He wasn't actively, I'm not aware of him actively campaigning for or against various operations. The only time in the research that I conducted that he sort of played a significant role was, of course, he finally wrote, how Churchill expressed a desire to be in the Normandy beaches on the 6th of June, to watch the operation from one of the British warships and be very close to the beaches. And of course, he eventually gave up on that idea when George VI wrote to him and said, well, Prime Minister, if you're going to do that as your sovereign, I must be there with you. And of course, Churchill said, oh no, that wouldn't be practical, so I wouldn't go either. But I'm not aware of George VI having any great role in trying to influence policy.
Okay, thank you. Good question from Thomas Williams here. Did Churchill's foot dragging delay Overlord in any meaningful way?
No, I don't think it did. The first date they come up with for Overlord, I think it was set during the Trident Anglo-American Conference of May 1943. And that was the first time a clear and unambiguous date was given for Overlord and how many divisions would take part. It was finally agreed, but after been outsmarted and out-argued by the British at the Casablanca conference, the Americans really got their game together and started to coordinate their responses and strategy, because they hadn't really done that a lot. Prior to that, Roosevelt and Marshall just met sporadically. But in preparation for the Trident Conference of May 1943, I think the Americans commissioned, 30 different papers looking at all the strategic options that were available to them. And they also had a code phrase if they didn't want to agree to something. They had this code phrase, I'm having a paper prepared on this. So it was at the Trident Conference with the Americans much better prepared. And of course, we must remember it was in this 1943 that the Pentagon was developed. And I think that symbolizes Americans' growing organization and economic and military strength. But one of the outcomes of Trident was Overlord on the 1st of May and supported by 29 divisions. So 1st of May was the original target date for Overlord. And then at the Eureka Conference, they shifted it back to the 30th of May because Stalin indicated that he didn't care when it happened in May, as long as it happened in May. And Alan Brooke said, well, we obviously want things, to coincide the Soviet operation on the Eastern Front and the Normandy operation to collaborate as much as possible. So why don't we aim for the end of May? Because no great Soviet offensive has really started before the end of May. So they shifted it back to the end of May, and Stalin was fine with that. And then it was further tweaked because the two conditions that had to be met for the operation was a full moon for the parachute drop and low tides, so they could do the landings, and all the Rommel asparagus and stuff would be visible. So then they consulted their lunar and tidal charts, and the first date on which those two conditions would be met would be the 5th and 6th of June. So it was originally meant to go ahead on the 5th of June, but Group Captain Stagg said, no, the weather's terrible. And then he said, but it looks like there'll be a window to do it on the 6th of June. So, of course, and you can imagine, no wonder Eisenhower was getting through about 4 or 5 packs of cigarettes in one day, the stress that was on that man. And he made the decision after consulting all these key principles. He said, right, let's go. And of course, it was very fortunate because the next dates that would be suitable with a full moon and a low tide would be the 19th and 20th of June. And of course, that was when there were extremely severe storms that destroyed the American Mulberry Harbour and really damaged the British one. So hopefully if they'd gone for that day, Stagg would have picked up on it. But thank goodness he went for the 6th of June and it worked out okay.
Yeah, thank you. Rob Crane has a couple of questions. Going back to culverin, I'll put the map up. Why does Graeme focus on culverin rather than the other Far East amphibious operations that got cancelled?
Was that the one? Because culverin was the proposal that's what triggered the big controversy with the chiefs of staff. That was where the clash between Churchill and the chiefs of staff in spring 1944 was focused on culverin. As Brooke made clear in his communications with Field Marshal Dill, the chiefs of staff preference was to work in tandem with MacArthur's secondary thrust up the Southwest Pacific, using Australia as a base, and they were dead set against culverin. But Churchill Well, quite rightly, as you would expect, he believed strongly that culverin was a good operation. And the thing that really sort of crystallized it after a scrap with the American fleet, I can't remember the exact numbers, but surviving, Japanese battleships, cruisers, etc., retreated back to Singapore to lick their wounds. And Churchill said, right, with these major warships in Singapore, that constitutes a threat to us in India, etc. And of course, the chiefs of staff took the contrary view and said, well, if there's huge, big Japanese naval vessels in Singapore, that's an argument against culverin. And, because they were originally planning to land on northern Sumatra and then cross the Malacca Straits into Malaya. So, I mean, as I indicated at one point, certainly Brooke said that the chiefs of staff were contemplating an en masse resignation at the end of March, and that was because of Churchill's insistence on culverin and doing things like packing meetings against them to try and isolate them politically, writing to them not as a collective body, the chiefs of staff, but as individual senior officers. And of course, fortunately, on that very day when the chiefs of staff were contemplating en masse resignation, which Ismay had picked up on and communicated to Churchill, in Washington, the American chiefs were contemplating operations, and that's when they came out against anything as far south as that. And as the summer went on, it became less and less justifiable as a military operation because Japan was effectively detached from its southern conquests. To use a phrase that Churchill had employed earlier, all these southern conquests in Japan would be cut flowers in a vase or vase, however you say it. And Churchill had originally used that phrase about the British control of the Mediterranean, cutting off Italian forces in Africa from Italy. So he knew that if you get your naval forces, if you've got forces that are detached from their homeland or assets, they become valueless. And he was able to see that in the Mediterranean, but less so in the Pacific.
Okay. Thank you. Another question referring to Singapore and Malaya. It's again from Rob. Oh, no, it's from Caswain. Did British failure in 1941-42 defending Malay, Singapore, Burma factor into Churchill's push for culverin, perhaps attempting to redress that disaster? So Churchill definitely looks backwards sometimes. I mean, he cites Gallipoli and things like that from the First World War. Is there an element of wanting to sort of, not revenge isn't maybe the right word, but kind of as the question said, they've redressed that disaster with culverin, as well as being about the wider picture of the empire?
I think as well as losing those possessions in 1941 and early 42, what had also taken a bit of a beating was British prestige and the supposed superiority of the British as colonial masters. That had really taken a bit of a bash when not only another power, but an Asian power had displaced them very easily. So in addition to the desire to physically regain the valuable tin mines and rubber plantations, if British forces had gone into Malaya and Singapore and military, recaptured them, that would have demonstrated that, Britain is still a strong, virile imperial power. What happened in 41-42 was no more than an unfortunate blip, and it's back to business as usual. So it was, and I think in my talk I say it's not only about regaining valuable imperial real estate, but also restoring Britain's battered imperial prestige. And in one of the other quotes in my book, Churchill makes it clear that that's important. We were humiliated, and it was an especially traumatic event for Churchill. So, yeah, psychologically and politically, he felt a strong need that British forces should regain key British possessions.
Okay, thank you. An earlier question about the Balkans from Scott Grimwood. How did Churchill plan on defeating Hitler with a Balkan-focused strategy?
Well, he never got to develop his plans, really, because they never, crossed over into the Balkans. But on one or two occasions, he did give a hint of what he was for, and that was for forces in Italy to push right up into northeastern Italy and launch an amphibious assault across the Adriatic. This was a draft plan called Operation Armpit. An amphibious landing on the Istrian Peninsula right at the top of the Adriatic. And if they established a presence there, then they could push through the so-called Ljubljana Gap between the Julian Alps and the Dinaric Alps, which cover much of Yugoslavia. So they would go through the so-called Ljubljana Gap. And then once you get through that, then there is, the area around Hungary. That part of Europe is quite flat. So Churchill was hoping that they could go through the Ljubljana Gap into the Hungarian plains and establish a British presence in Vienna. And in one of his conversations with a group of Dominion prime ministers, I think it was on the 5th of May 1944, he made it clear that what he wanted to do was get into Southeast Europe and link up forces with the Russians. But I think, coordinating strategy with the Americans was quite a challenge. And, they're both, well, neither of them are communist states. And there was quite often a lot of friction there. But can you imagine if mainly British or Allied forces erupted into Central Europe and tried to coordinate operations with the Red Army? Stalin was obviously regarding that area as his backyard. He was clear that he wanted to develop a belt of defensive satellite states on his western border after Germany was defeated. And I think an eruption of Western Allied forces into Eastern Europe would have been potentially calamitous. That could have led to major friction, misunderstanding, friendly fire casualties. But of course, none of these operations came to plan, and Brooke was dead set against the Ljubljana Gap. He regarded it as fanciful nonsense. When Churchill was floating it, his response was, Prime Minister, if we try this at the time of year that Churchill was proposing it, he says, Prime Minister, if we go for that, we'll have three difficulties. We'll have the terrain, the German forces, and it'll be all snowy, and the weather temperatures will be against us. So fortunately, it never happened. But he did tentatively talk about gaining access to Central and Eastern Europe through this thing that only existed in his mind, the so-called Ljubljana Gap. And in my book, there's a quote from an American historian, Eric Larrabee, that makes it very clear that it wasn't a gap at all. It was a minor pass that could be easily defended by the Germans.
Okay, thank you. We have the comment in the sidebar. Yeah, well, you just mentioned that Brooks saying the gap was fanciful nonsense. So a question about 1943. You were saying that you didn't find much evidence of positivity about Operation Overlord. But devil's advocate is saying is that due to the fact in November 43 it was still the small version of Overlord before the extra beaches, and so maybe it's not Overlord per se they're objecting to, or that there's a lack of positivity about the size of the Overlord plan as it was at that point. So to put Rob's point in there, so November 43, everybody knew Freddie Morgan hadn't been given enough divisions. So is that part of the reason of the negativity at that point, about time of the war?
Well, that's an interesting point, and I must admit it's not something that I'd covered. The interesting thing about Churchill is he could maintain a lot of sometimes very contrary positions. At one point, I think it was in when the German forces were first, at the very end of 1942, when the Red Army first encircled German forces at Stalingrad, he began to talk for a short while very enthusiastically about the possibility of a landing in northwestern Europe. And at the Quadrant Conference, he again said that it was important to beef up the initial assault force of Overlord, and it was actually better not to fritter away forces. So he was rather, Churchill was always one for dispersing Allied forces, but he had an amazing capacity to contradict himself, you know.
Yeah.
And at the Quadrant Conference, he's on record as saying we should really think about beefing up the assault force for Overlord that we currently have in mind. And then, but rather then straight after that, he said, and we should also give a lot of priority to, you know, the operation that he returned to again and again to recapture Norway. You know, every time he brought that up, Brooke's blood pressure would go sky high. But I don't think the numbers really made a difference to Churchill. I don't think if by, you know, autumn 43 they'd already come up with the bigger plan that Montgomery developed, I don't think he would have been very enthusiastic about that either. But I think the person making that point, that's an interesting one which I'd like to do a bit more thinking about. But the reason I mentioned those two occasions where Churchill expressed some support for operations in northwestern Europe is, I think it's proved that I've done my very best to be honest to the archives. If I was simply wanting to smear Churchill, then things like that, which are, if you like, a little inconvenient to my main argument, I would have edited them out. But I didn't, because it's part of the historical record, and it was dishonourable and dishonest to exclude information that is challenging for your main thesis. So if people buy the book, they'll see that on occasion I give Churchill full credit when he expressed enthusiasm for Overlord. But as you know, he was his brain was a bit like lightning in a bottle. He could, you know, go through several different strategic positions in one day, and the enthusiasm that he occasionally expressed for Overlord wasn't maintained for long periods, whereas his enthusiasm for the Eastern Mediterranean, etc., was consistently maintained.
Okay, that's a good way of summing up. Thank you for that. So we had a question about the French. So Terry said, did de Gaulle and the French know about Churchill trying to evade Overlord and cancel Anvil? What did they think about it, if they did know?
Right, Paul, I'm very disappointed with these questions you're selecting. They're all focusing on things that I haven't covered in any great detail. I mean, you know, you know, de Gaulle and the French are worthy of a major series. Obviously, they deserve major serious studies. Again, as everybody knows, de Gaulle, and well, I think everybody had a rather prickly relationship with de Gaulle. I do think Churchill had a great deal of enthusiasm for him, but he knew he needed to keep him on side. I don't think that de Gaulle and the French, I think Churchill made sure that only relevant information about Allied strategy that he thought was appropriate would be fed to de Gaulle. And I think he was actually rather annoyed when he was told rather late in the day about when Overlord was going to
he was very grumpy,
launch.
de Gaulle, very
and
grumpy,
at one point he was refusing to give a radio broadcast. Yes.
Well, he kind of threatened to not do
Churchill kept him out of the loop. So again, it took a lot of persuading. De Gaulle eventually he eventually gave in, because he knew that history would not be kind to him if he refused to give the broadcast on the eve of D-Day. But Churchill kept him out of the loop. And the interesting thing was, one of the reasons that the Americans were so keen to do Anvil, which became Dragoon, was after they'd re-equipped a large number of French colonial divisions, which were based in North Africa. And the plan was that they would contribute to Dragoon. And of course, that was something that the French were very positive about, because although it was obviously colonial troops from French North Africa, it was part of the French Empire. So obviously, that was something that the French liked. And if they knew Churchill was hostile to it, that wouldn't, generate a lot of enthusiasm from them.
Right. Thank you. Good answer to that. So questions about Churchill's kind of post-war aspirations and things. This is sort of a comment really from Morgan Hale first. I think much of Churchill's machinations was about shaping the post-war world to Britain's and the Allies' advantage. Churchill's forte was grand strategy, operational, not so much. So I saw a comment there from Morgan. But on a sort of similar theme, World War II Analysed is saying, did Churchill consider the cost to the empire of the world crediting the USSR with defeating Nazism? That was world opinion after the war, mostly scrubbed from Western consciousness. So quite a lot to unpack with that question there. But 20 years ago, when relationships with Russia and the wider Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, were very good, historians writing about the West always had to make that comment about a lot of the war being won on the East, and for every German soldier killed in the West, it was 7 or 8 killed in the East, etc., etc., etc. But the post-war, just as the Western allies are now beginning a Cold War against the Soviet Union, there is this idea of the fact that it was the Soviets who raised the flag in Berlin, etc., etc. So to the question there, did Churchill have a thought about what impact it would be giving the Soviets a lot of credit for winning the war and how that would affect the empire?
A lot of credit.
Not in any of the research that I've explored. It never really come up. Eden does refer to it when Churchill, basically, as you know, in the first half of 1944, the transport plan was developed to bomb the marshalling yards as a means of ensuring the Germans couldn't rush reinforcements to northwestern France. And Eden and Churchill were very exercised about the prospect of how high the French casualties would be, and how that would affect French attitudes towards Britain. And Eden at one point raised the subject of saying, in a world where people are looking more to the Soviet Union than we would like, if we kill lots of French civilians in a botched effort to bomb marshalling yards, that will only increase the people being inclined to be sympathetic towards the Soviet Union. But again, Churchill, I think he had a sort of a very strange view about the emperor. He saw it as a great source of prestige to Britain, and it generated a lot of wealth for British businesses and London as the stock exchange. But he tended not to. He really kept the Dominion heads. They were excluded from active roles in shaping war strategy. He would maybe meet with them, but nothing they would say would really sort of influence what he regarded as the priorities. He very much regarded them as the secondary country cousins. So I don't think he was thinking much of that. And see, I don't know. In the immediate post-war world, there was much thought given to the great role that the Soviet Union played in tearing the guts out of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. It was very much in the English-speaking world, it was emphasizing the role of the British and the Americans in liberating Western Europe. And they weren't obviously going to, I mean, it degenerated into Cold War quite quickly. So they weren't going to sort of acknowledge the importance of the role that the Soviet Union played.
Okay. Thank you. So one for me this time, and it's about the 6th of August aid memoir from 1943 and how that demonstrates or shows what some of the British military thinking was at that time of the war. So I forget whether you mentioned that in the previous 2 shows or not, but it was one of the talking points. So the August the 6th aid memoir, please.
Okay, well, this is a document that I haven't seen analysed in any of the other books that I've read. And it was something that was drafted by the chiefs of staff as they were either sailing over to Washington for the Quadrant Conference or just before they went. And just to give a bit of context to it, on the 15th of July, General Morgan submitted his draft Overlord plan to the British Chiefs of Staff, and it was eventually passed on to the Americans. And he said that one of the things that was essential for the operation's success was to eliminate German fighter strength so that the Allies had air superiority over the beaches. He said that is absolutely essential. And he talked about various ways of doing it. And the 6th of August aid memoir was developed by the Chiefs of Staff, supposedly as a means of eliminating or significantly weakening Germany's fighter strength as a means of aiding Overlord. So what they said was, and you must remember, but by the 6th of August, Allied forces hadn't cleared the Germans out of Sicily, so they've not crossed over to the mainland yet. But what the 6th of August aid memoir said was, the best way in which we can help Overlord is to advance as far north as capture the area around Milan and Turin and the airfields in that region, and use those airfields to then bomb the German aircraft factories building Me-109s in Augsburg and Regensburg. So they're proposing this in August 1943 to help an operation, to attrit German fighter strength for an operation scheduled for May. So if you work backwards, if they're going to have if they're really going to damage German fighter production in the Messerschmitt factories in Augsburg or Regensburg, they have to start doing that in the spring of 1944, 2 or 3 months before Overlord. So they have to start doing that by spring 1944. But let's say they got as far north as Milan and Turin. It's highly unlikely that the Germans would have left those airfields in good condition. They would have blown them up and damaged them. And obviously, those airfields might not have been suited for, the heavy Allied bombers. So basically, if this crackerjack plan is going to achieve success, they have to get to Milan and Turin, the Po Valley, by, say, January 1944. To get the airfields capable of accommodating large Allied bombers and then start blasting the aircraft factories. So they're planning an advance of about 800 miles up the Italian peninsula, which, as we know, is very mountainous, and by October, November, December, it'll be winter, fighting against unbroken German forces. I mean, does that sound like a realistic proposal to you, given that they haven't even cleared Sicily by that date, to advance 800 miles up the leg of Italy in 4 months? So yeah. I think this is just another example of the fantasy thinking of the Chiefs of Staff. They always seem to have this bizarre notion that maybe because it was in the summer, a nice, warm, sunny place, that, operations in the Mediterranean, Southern Europe would go really smoothly. And of course, the ironic thing is, while they are planning an adventurous operation up the leg of Italy in 4 months to reach Milan and Turin by January 44, they did an appreciation of the draft Overlord plan on the 10th of August. And to quote, one of their concerns about the suitability of the plan was they warned that, quote, the country south of the Cannes beaches is admirable for delaying actions by the enemy. So they find it very easy to identify terrain difficulties in Normandy as one of the reasons why it might not be advisable to go ahead with Overlord. But they're willing to talk about advancing up the Apennine Mountains 800 miles from the toe of Italy to Milan in approximately 4 months, so they can then make a major contribution to Overlord's success by bombing the Messerschmitt factories of Augsburg and Regensburg. And I think that just illustrates the bizarre, fantastical thinking of the chiefs of staff and their cockeyed strategy. And nobody else I'm aware of has examined this document as an illustration of what Costs were thinking. And, I'm reading James Holland's book about the Italian campaign, and he's talking about, taking Rome. And the whole idea of that was, well, they wanted to take Rome and 50 miles north of it, so they could, as to make sure that the Germans couldn't advance south and capture Foggia. So, but my argument is no, the things like this 6th of August 1943 aid memoir show that they were committed to going right into the north of Italy if they could get away with it. And I think that was a highly questionable strategy to suggest when they haven't even cleared Sicily and advanced
no, good point.
800 miles in 4 months against unbroken defensive features of Sardines.
No, thank you. So I want to bring up Sledgehammer, 1942, the planned operation against the possibly planned against the Cotentin and Normandy. So I find it's one of those things that historians use it to hit various people over, use it as a stick to hit people with. Some people use it to criticize Marshall and the Americans. Some use it to sort of talk about the Soviets trying to, put pressure on things. How do you fit Sledgehammer and perhaps round up into your Churchill thesis?
Well, okay, about Sledgehammer, this was the way I interpret it was conceived as a last resort emergency measure. It was only to take place under what two circumstances if they developed. It was to be launched as an emergency measure if the Red Army looked like it was going to severely collapse and crumble, and they would then try to land on the Cotentin Peninsula in order to give aid to the Soviet Union, which I think is a rational thing to do, because given how as you said earlier, about 80 or 85% of German battlefield casualties were on the Eastern Front. So the Americans knew that it was absolutely vital to keep the Soviet Union fighting in the war. So they said, okay, if it looks like the Soviets are going to collapse, we should launch this diversionary operation that will hopefully draw some of the German forces away from the east. And the other circumstances under which it was to be launched would be if there was a sudden, unexpected crack in the German position, either because of, Hitler been assassinated or some out of the blue event that, showed that the Germans were starting to crack. So it's usually advanced, the British, of course, and Churchill were opposed to it, but I don't think it was conceived as a definite planned operation. And it's cited as an example of Churchill's strategic wisdom. He said, this will be a disaster. We'll get a bloody nose. We'll lose troops. It'll embolden the Germans. But Marshall and the Americans only wanted it to go ahead if either of those two conditions were met: a crack in the German morale and military position, or a crack in the Soviet Union. And the other thing you must take into account, my reading of it was, we're talking about a 5-division operation. But because there were so few American troops in the UK at that point, 3.5 of those divisions would be British and only 1.5 would be American. And that effectively gave the British a veto over it, plus the fact that it could only obviously launch from Channel ports with enthusiastic British support. So again, I'm reluctant to look at Churchill's opposition to sledgehammer as a great sign of his strength 2 or 43, because the Americans said it should only happen if these two extreme cases, circumstances were met. So that's my thoughts on sledgehammer.
Okay, thank you. So a question from Gunnar over in the Netherlands. So we're talking about Churchill's memoirs post-war. Did Churchill ever say anything about his Empire First strategy far after the war? I mean, he lives till 1965. The empire gone must have been painful for him, especially in hindsight, a waste of the sacrifice of people. So did he kind of hint at anything in the early 60s about his policies or his thoughts about the empire that is pertinent to your thesis?
Well, in some of his, as you know, he wrote his 6-volume account of the Second World War, which was published in the late 40s, early 50s. And there were a few instances in those memoirs where he says, some people accuse me of not wanting to do Overlord, but that's utter rubbish, and here's the proof that I was really keen on it. But what he did was he practiced omission rather than commission. He basically made sure that all the documents where he expressed negativity about Overlord simply didn't appear in his 6 volumes of war memoirs. And if people want to know more about that, they should probably look at David Reynolds' book, In Command of History, which I certainly profited from reading. So, for example, the 19th of October 1943, Churchill met with the chiefs of staff and he outlined the 5 priorities that he thought the Allies should pursue if Britain was shaping Allied military strategy. And the first 3 were all Italy, the Aegean, the Balkans, continue the bombing strategy. And then the lowest priority was number 5, some vague, wishy-washy commitment to building up American forces in the UK for use somewhere that was never specified. That document, I mean, there's tons of documents that appear in Churchill's memoirs, but not that one, and not some of the other documents where he is very negative and skeptical. So what he tended to do was simply exclude inconvenient material that was that showed up his very, very limited enthusiasm for Overlord and operations in northwestern Europe. And of course, the thing is that it was only, some people refer to, Churchill's role in the Overlord Preparation Committee, but it only started meeting from the 1st of March onwards. And it was only a weekly thing. And, that to me does not suggest, a big, positive enthusiasm for Overlord.
Okay.
But he did, after Anzio failed and Overlord started to develop its own momentum from March 1944 onwards, he was reconciled to it. He knew there was Tina, there is no alternative. So he he couldn't do anything else to support it, to try and block it, and he sort of went along with it. But I would argue he was a reluctant convert, and his aspiration to be on a British cruiser in Normandy, I think that was just a bit performative. He'd worship watching the dragoon landings, and he wrote to his wife saying, "I'm watching these landings, they're going very well, but they should never have happened." So Churchill, he could have, simply being present in an operation didn't mean that he was always its biggest supporter all along.
Okay, thank you. So I'm kind of rewording a couple of comments that have come in the sidebar. So FDR, obviously, Roosevelt doesn't survive the war. He dies before the thing is over. Stalin is all about increasing the power and prestige of the Soviet Union and maintaining control over what he's got. Churchill, no matter, he probably was surprised by the results of the 45 election, but he knows he's towards the latter part of his career, certainly not at the beginning part of his career. Is his thinking about the empire to do with wanting to leave some kind of legacy, in addition to his rallying cry in 1940, sort of go out on a bang and, I'm trying to save the principle, the idea, the notion, the concept of the empire, which now, 80 years on from World War II, it feels a bit outdated, because we realize that self-determination, countries going their own way, was the right move. But back at the time in 44, 45, was that what Churchill was thinking, that he could kind of leave this sort of legacy of is that, I mean, that's sort of the point of your book in some ways, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's why the book starts in 1874, 75. Churchill, I mean, it was his doctor, Lord Moran, he wrote his account of his time with Churchill, and he said it's when Churchill talks about other races that you realise he really is a Victorian product. He's a product of the Victorian era. Some of the terms he used to describe non-white people. And I think that's the case when Churchill and his generation were growing up, within the ruling class, and large portions of the rest of British society, just thought the empire is a central fact in our existence. It's a matter of great pride. I think every classroom throughout the UK had maps on its wall with all the imperial territory in red. And I think Churchill just found it very difficult to imagine a world in which the empire didn't exist, both as a generator of wealth for Britain, or maybe come to the certain stratas of British society, and a great matter of prestige and proof that, of white superiority. My view, I mean, you've obviously talked about the rights of, people to self-determination. But, one of the things that I include in my book is, we think, right, the empire reaches its peak, in the last decade or so before the First World War. But round about the same time, simultaneously with Queen Victoria dying, one of the Rowntree family, the chocolate manufacturers, he was a pioneering social scientist. And he did, I don't know if you've come across this, Paul, a study of poverty in York. So basically, he figured out what an average family needed to survive, just to maintain basic physical efficiency in terms of rent, food, clothes, fuel, etc. He worked out what was needed to maintain very basic physical efficiency, and then converted that into a monetary value. And then he did research amongst the people of York. And what he found out was that 10% of the population of York, no matter how efficiently they spent their family income, they would never have enough to maintain basic physical efficiency. And another 18%, if they were frivolous and wasted a farthing on buying a newspaper or taking a tram ride to work, they would be plunged into that level of poverty. So 28% of your, and by the way, Rowntree's measures were very, very frugal. So he found out that in York, which wasn't the most impoverished part of the UK, 28% of people were experiencing difficulty in maintaining basic physical efficiency. And that number tallies almost perfectly with the 30% of Boer War potential recruits that were rejected as being physically unfit. So when we talk about the majesty of the British Empire and how it was wonderful and a great source of wealth, what we must remember was all that wealth was going in to the city of London and, you know, the heads of large businesses. It wasn't getting shared evenly amongst the British people. A lot of them were living in terrible poverty, and on average, 30% of Boer War recruits were rejected as physically unfit. In some of the larger industrial cities like Birmingham, Manchester, and Liverpool, it went up to 60%. So this, of course, became a bit of a scandal. Churchill read Rowntree's book on poverty. It influenced him during his early sort of crusading, you know, when he was an enthusiastic young Liberal minister, and that basically, because when you realise that 30% of your potential soldiers are unacceptable to the army, how are you going to maintain forces to keep control of the empire? How can you justify notions of white racial superiority if, you know, 3 out of every 10 young men aren't suitable for the army? So the response, the Liberals said, that's why we need to start introducing a basic welfare state to bring people up to scratch. And at the time, the Tories were very hostile to it. And to his credit, you know, in the early part of his career, Churchill, he was very much influenced by Rowntree's work and said, you know, how does it glory a country if it, you know, if it can't flush its sewers properly? You know, how, you know, what's the point in having an empire if you can't flush your sewers properly? So this whole thing about the empire being a great source of wealth to Britain is bollocks. I don't think the ordinary British people really benefited a lot from the empire. The profits from the tin mines in Malaya and the rubber plantations were getting into the hands of stockbrokers and the financial elite.
Well, we're into that modern discussion about billionaires today, aren't we? You know, the concept of what they call it trickle down economics, which I frankly think is mostly a load of old bollocks. You know, it's just that these things, billionaires just keep on getting richer and richer, but their wealth doesn't necessarily make it better for people on the street. And Andrew Harrison just made the point that people even today, surveys about people living on the breadline are demonstrating similar figures to what you were saying about the Rowntree family, is that everybody's only really 2 pay packets away from you know, financial destitution. So, you know, it's but to bring it back to the conversation, one of the things we had there was Jeff made a good point. Was there a general political consensus, and I think he means among the population in the UK, for empire first, for Churchill to pursue the strategy? I mean, this kind of connects with what you were just saying about people more worried about where they're going to get their next pair of shoes from. And I can only speak from my grandparents' point of view, and I can tell you they didn't give a flying fuck about whether or not Britain owned Malaya or India in 1944-45. What they were thinking about is, you know, child income support, that type of thing, the railways, the work after the war, would they get their jobs back? So I think Churchill's out on a fairly a narrow limb with the idea of caring about empire. I mean, that's separate, of course, to people within the empire.
Yeah, I mean, what really motivated, you know, one of the interesting things about World War II is that the Beveridge Report was a huge bestseller. You know, the blueprint for what became the welfare state and state intervention in the economy. That was published, first made available in 42 or 43, and, you know, huge numbers of, it went through several reprints. It was hugely popular amongst British service personnel. That was the vision that was more important to them. And of course, that's what found expression in the 1945 general election, which led to the Attlee government. And within a couple of years, just over 2 years of them getting elected, India is given its independence. So, yeah, without wanting to, stereotype maybe the sort of more enthusiastic readers of the Daily Mail of the time would be concerned about the empire and British imperial greatness. But you must remember, World War II developed directly after the Hungry 30s. A lot of poverty and unemployment, especially in the older industrial areas of the UK. And I think British people were saying, well, we volunteered, we made huge sacrifices in the First World War. They told us they'd create a land fit for heroes, and they shafted us. That's not going to happen again. And I think that's why there was such a Labour landslide, because they created the vision that resonated with the British people who did want a different society and weren't going to be played for suckers again.
Yeah, I mean, that Jonathan Fennell, I think it is, particularly, and Daniel Todman made points in their books about all the education programs the British Army, the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy were getting, sending out pamphlets to people, overseas and things about unions and they were trying to, in some ways, make the point that the Third Reich and the Axis that they're fighting aren't giving their troops the benefit of a ability to kind of criticize their government, criticize their leaders. They, that this was the British saying, look, we're a democracy. We're going to give our people, you have the right to complain about the spam fritters you're being served for the 6th time this week, that kind of thing. But what it does is it does really begin to educate ordinary people about the visions of equality and social care and welfare, the welfare state and things like that, which obviously people had been talking about that for decades. But really, when you start producing official pamphlets and giving them to troops, I mean, that's part, as we're talking about, that's part of the reason the election goes the way it does in 1945, is people do have a different image of things before, after the war. But to bring it back to the thesis and the Overlord, we've got a few more questions again. So eventually, obviously, Churchill does have to, get behind Overlord, despite his initial doubts about it that you've explained in such detail. But World War II Analysed is saying, for Graeme, did Winston Churchill feel pressured by Beaverbrook and lots of the Labour press and organisations pressing for a second front? So when he's the kind of guy who makes his own decisions, but there is public opinion, there is information, there is a press, there are people like George Orwell and others writing. So do you think he feels under any pressure to eventually get behind it a bit more fully?
I've come across no evidence in the documents and the research that I did that these things weighed heavily on Churchill's mind. Yeah, there was a lot of noise and chatter, and if you watch The World at War, there's, it's got an excerpt from Beaverbrook's, a speech of Beaverbrook saying, the importance of the second front. And of course, Churchill had a very on-off love-hate relationship with Beaverbrook. Sometimes he was a great friend, and, he was the Minister for Aircraft Production in 1940. Clementine Churchill detested Beaverbrook and thought it was a very bad example on her husband. But there's no evidence that I've come across that Churchill was particularly swayed by public opinion very much throughout the war. He was operating at a higher level, very much focused on digesting all the documents that were presented to him, going to conferences with the United States and the Soviet Union, attending meetings with the chiefs of staff, etc. I mean, there was a moratorium on, I think Labour and the Tories agreed, that we won't contest elections throughout the war. Now, there were some by-elections in some of the smaller parties, like the Commonwealth Party, and I think the SNP actually won a by-election during World War II. That was their very first member of parliament. He held a seat for a few months and then was swept away in 1945. So, yeah, it's fine that there's a lot of chatter, but because the electoral cycle has been postponed for the crisis situation of the war, there's no way for that to convert into political pressure on Churchill. And I don't think the only time Churchill was under significant pressure was, in the first few months of 1942 after the ignominious surrender of Singapore.
Yeah.
And he sort of had to, at one point there was talk of Sir Stafford Cripps, who of course had been the ambassador to the Soviet Union. He enjoyed a quite significant popularity for a short while. And after the Churchill knew he was under pressure after the loss of Singapore, so he had a bit of a cabinet reshuffle, and more prominence was given to Labour members. And I think that's when Attlee was formally acknowledged as Deputy Prime Minister. So he did come under pressure from, time and again through Westminster, and there was a couple of occasions faced votes of confidence, which he always won. But I don't think he was overly swayed by public opinion because it couldn't translate into votes and loss of MP because the electoral process had been suspended for the duration.
Okay, thank you. Well, we'll move to some maybe slightly quicker questions as we gradually move towards the end of this. So Jim Walsh is saying, and you obviously had to read a lot of Churchill for this book. What do you think about Churchill being awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature? I mean, he's certainly a better writer than Hitler, but Hitler set a very low benchmark with Mein Kampf, which is a dreadfully written book, as well as being an incredibly shitty thinking about the world, but it's just awfully written. And you made a point in all of these discussions, Graeme, Churchill wrote a lot. He wrote a lot. Did he deserve the Nobel Peace Prize? Nobel Prize Literature, sorry?
Well, I'm not going to be negative or mean-spirited. Fair play to him. He wrote tons of stuff. He wrote a lot. But my view is sort of related to one of the questions that one of the topics I suggested to you, Paul, that we might want to consider. And that, what do Churchill and Damien Hirst and Jeff Koons have in common? And my answer to that is, if you buy a Damien Hirst piece of art, or a piece of art, associated with Jeff Koons, it might not actually have been produced by them, because they maintain, and you'll like this French word, Paul, an atelier. They have lots of assistants in a workshop creating their artwork. So Damien Hirst and Jeff Koons might come up with the idea for an art piece, but they won't necessarily waste their valuable time manufacturing it. And to some extent, the writing of the Second World War was conducted in a similar manner, because Churchill, I think, were they known as the Syndicate? He had a group of maybe half a dozen writers assisting him. Now, by no means am I suggesting he was a bad writer, questioning his literary ability, but he was not the sole author of the Second World War. What I think would happen, and again, this is covered in Reynolds' book, In Command of History, some of the people who had gone and become Oxbridge Dons basically mastered the Churchill style of writing, and they would do like the first drafts of various chapters. Then they would submit it to Churchill. I mean, he did write large chunks of it himself, but he wasn't the exclusive author. So they would write chapters and bits and pieces, and then he would submit it to Churchill, and he would maybe tweak it a little bit, and that would then go into the book. So Churchill, I would certainly suggest, I wouldn't begrudge him his Nobel Prize for Literature, but maybe it should have been shared more evenly with members of the syndicate who helped him write it. So again, to make clear, I've not been mean-spirited. Churchill was a great writer. He had great flair and a very distinctive style, amazing vocabulary, skill in expressing himself. He wrote large chunks of the 6 volumes, but he wasn't the sole author. It was very much a team effort, and that's why I say there's a bit of overlap between him and Jeff Koons and Damien Hirst.
Yeah, well, I was given a copy of Boris Johnson's biography of Churchill a few years ago. I kind of left it in my van as like emergency toilet paper because it wasn't very good, and allegedly he didn't write much of it at all. But one of these slightly interesting things, it probably was the bit he didn't write himself, Boris Johnson, was that there are chunks of Churchill's speeches from the war that don't read the way Churchill wrote his best speeches, and the suggestion is that even some of the speeches were actually written by other people, or at least partly written by other people, because they don't fulfill these kind of little rules of literature that he had. He had these sort of syntax and certain rhythmic ways of writing, and some of his speeches just don't fulfill the Churchill criteria, and that it was words he said, but maybe not words he himself composed, which is not necessarily directly related to the comment you're making. And I can't believe I've referenced Boris Johnson in the conversation, one of my least favorite human beings of the last 20 years.
You've outed yourself as a closet Boris fan. No, well, I'm not going to go again too far. In his defense, you must remember Churchill was, he was born, he turned 70 in 1944. He was, quite an elderly figure. Obviously, he had a lot of energy, as you would say, of a good midfield player. He had a good engine. He kept going for a long time. But can you imagine the pressure he was under? Dealing with, especially in the first part of the war, where it was disaster after disaster. So I don't begrudge him. If somebody, we all know nowadays that if major politicians get up and do a speech, they've probably not written it. They've gone over it and they've maybe tweaked it a wee bit. So it's entirely plausible that, Churchill had some assistance, because there was so much demands on his time. And I think basically, I float the idea, by the latter stages of the war, I think he was exhausted. He had pneumonia, couple of heart attacks. He was an older man. I think he was really drained. And I can't blame him. So I think we should always, one of the things, although I've obviously, Churchill's in the title, I think one of the things I object to a lot of mainstream media representations of Churchill is that he won the war single-handedly. It was a team effort. It was the Chamberlain government that commissioned the Spitfire and the Hurricane and radar, and, all these. I find it offensive when people basically say Churchill saved us in 1940. If you go onto YouTube, there's an interview with Douglas Bader, and the interviewer says, "Oh, you pilots were heroes and blah blah, great people." And Bader's very quick and says it was a team effort. We relied very heavily on the ground crew who maintained our aircraft, the people who did all the plotting. He was very quick to say it was a collective effort. And I think
was that the one and only time
World War II.
Was that the one and only time Douglas Bader was charitable? Another one of my least favorite people of the last. I will just share a very, very brief Douglas Bader story from my own childhood. I was about, and I'll go to the more round things. I was about, 9 or 10 or something. I was at an air show with my dad, and he was a VIP at this air show, and he wasn't he wasn't in the middle of something. He was just sort of by the flight line, sort of vaguely looking out towards the aircraft. And I had a copy of one of Douglas Bader's books. I forget which one it was I had then. And my dad said, well, you should go and ask him if he will sign it, or go and ask him if he'll get an autograph in it. So I'm from a working class lad from Essex, but I kind of went up and practiced my my best English. And I went up and I sort of politely stood in front of him and said, "Mr. Barder, sir, would you do me the honor of signing your book there?" And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, bugger off, you horrible little child." He said, "That is my absolute genuine encounter." So I walked off. Like I stood there for a few seconds, sort of mouth open, like, okay. And I just went off. And my dad said, "Did you get your book signed?" I said, "No, I didn't." Anyway, to kind of wind things down now, Graeme, because it's been a fantastic conversation. I very much appreciated the way that, you know, you're still considering your this whole Churchill and Overlord and Churchill's role. I mean, it would be in some ways, even though you have spent many years on this book, to just say that you're finished with this and that's it, I know everything, would be naive. As you said, Churchill had so much influence with so many people, and so many people said things about Churchill. Andreas asked earlier, are you working on a new book? Is there going to be a second volume where you kind of or a second edition or something?
My aspiration is to try and get the book made into a documentary. I used to work in television. I find the quality of analysis. I mean, a lot of the documentaries that appear in British TV, as far as I'm concerned, it's Mills and Boon with Spitfires. It's just a really disappointing, flat, two-dimensional, you know, repetition of a lot of ridiculous myths. So what I would like to do is to turn Empire First into a really compelling documentary. I've got a script. Somebody's volunteered to do a bit of filming. I might even like to try and do it rather than, you know, in addition to the content, I find the style of a lot of history documentaries very boring. You know, it's usually some boring old fart doing pieces to camera in a symbolic battlefield. What I'd like to do it as digitally animated, so that it could all be done in an animation studio in Glasgow or, you know, somewhere in Scotland, rather than, you know, schlepping over to, you know, Anzio or any of these historic locations, because it's just boring. So I want to make a documentary which is both revolutionary in content and in form, and by that means tilt the world on its axis. I want to completely, my mission in life is to completely, totally transform the popular historiography of World War II, because there's too much myth-making and fantasy, and I want people to share the excitement. Once I stumbled on this subject that I've ended up, you know, spending 15 or 20 years on, it was just absolutely fascinating. And if people, I want people to pick up my book and say, right, I'm going to write an article or do something myself and be motivated and enthused, because I think that's the best thing you can do as a creator in any field, to encourage people to have new thoughts and ideas and maybe think about doing their own thing.
Yeah.
So if somebody comes along and writes an even better book about World War II, I'll be delighted. You know, I'll learn from it. Yeah. And that's how, you know, history it's not set in aspect, it's not fossilized, it's an ongoing dialogue between those who love it and who respect the evidence and archive. So if somebody comes up with a document that blows my analysis out of the water, I'll take it on the chin, I'll acknowledge it, just as I acknowledge those occasions where Churchill espoused fleeting pro-Overlord sentiments.
Well, perhaps we'll try putting your camera back on to finish things off. The buffering seems to have started. So if you can come back in so we can say goodbye to you at some point. And I think one of my feelings is, I think we're, as a society, we're so fear of fear of failure. It's that why all they're talking about is remaking movies. Music is just covers of old songs. Movies is rehashing this, rehashing Batman, rehashing this, another remake. And I think that there's an element of that in history programming, as you said there. It's just that, okay, we could do something really controversial and look at something else, but hang on, why don't we do another one about how bloody great the Dam Busters were and how they flew at 50 feet for how many hours into Germany, because everyone loves all that. And, you know, and but at the same time, the public devour that stuff as well. The public need to be a bit more discerning as well, and not just take everything that we are spoon-fed the narrative. We ought to start saying, you know, I'm not going to watch that documentary about Colditz. I've seen 20 documentaries about Colditz. I don't need another one, kind of thing. But anyway,
Yes.
people are saying, you know, thanks, Graeme, as always. Thanks, Woody. Someone said earlier, George Collins said, started reading the book. Very interesting info about Churchill's early pre-World War II years and the growth of the empire, learning a lot. And I think that's it. I mean, you wouldn't, no one would want everybody to just read your book and agree with everything, because it doesn't spark dialogue. You want people to go, that makes a point, but push back and reevaluate, because that's where we should be now. All of these figures who led us through World War II are long since dead now. We're not gonna upset you know, Alan Burke or General Marshall now if we criticize what they said in 42 or 43. It's we should be okay to look back and say, you know what, maybe the Allies bungled that bit. Maybe they should have done that better. Maybe they went down the wrong path on this particular thing. It's, you know, we can do it. So folks, there we are. We will bring things in. So I've got a bit of a light week coming up, because bizarrely, I am going out on Tuesday filming with a film crew where I am going to be the middle-aged historian standing in a battlefield doing pieces to camera. So so there you are. But it's a paying job, so I'm doing it. So it'll be good.
You can't turn that down.
I can't turn down a paying job in this day and age. And so I will be doing some stuff for History Hit, which is Dan Snow's company. Anyway, folks, you know already to check out the link to Graeme's website, and consider reading the book if you haven't already. And as I say, keep thinking, reconsidering Churchill. There's a lot to think about with Churchill. I don't ever want to be in a position where I think I understand him. I can just say, okay, I've drawn the line under Winston now. I know that guy. There's a lot of levels to Churchill, as there are Montgomery and Hitler and Stalin and all these people, and they can deal with a bit of analysis from us. So, Graeme, been fantastic talking. I've enjoyed these 3 shows. I will see you on Tuesday when we are talking with Stuart about his father, who was a navigator in the Royal Air Force and had an incredible story, ended up in Stag Love 3 on the Death March, knew all the great escapers, all that kind of stuff. That's Tuesday. And I will see you all later on. Cheers, Graeme. Cheers, viewers. See you next time. Bye.